The world is calling, turn the page. Be an agent of change, don't look away. It starts with you today. Make a difference, rise and shine. Live the world, one heart, one mind. This is the optimal life with Elliot Barnett, where hope begins and dreams are set.
Welcome to the second episode of the Optimal Life podcast. My name is Elliot Barnett, and I'm excited for you to be here today to learn how to help others or help yourself live an optimal life. Well, how do we make that happen? We make that happen through the certification programs at elliottbarnett.com in CRT and the associated frameworks like the ARRATE framework. It has been a decade now since CRT was formed after the original research studies came to their conclusion. Of course, I've still been evolving CRT since then, but today I wanted to spend a little bit of time going through those original research studies together to make sure that it was understood where all this came from and the foundational studies that really empowered the original mental health programs that have been so successful in this past decade. It is really important as you move forward to really leverage well-founded, research-backed approaches like CRT and the frameworks that have been demonstrated to be successful in helping people live a better life, like the ARRATE framework. So let's get into it together. Let's talk about the original research studies that I started back in the early 2000s and came to their conclusion in around 2015. This all came out of my frustration that I experienced in my 20s when I was struggling, like so many young adults do, looking for help in the mental health industry and recognizing that the current approaches and the frameworks and the modalities that most mental health professionals were using seemed largely ineffective. It's not that they weren't helpful at all. They were, but it seemed like there was a lot of limitations and certainly a lot of gaps in the approaches. And I didn't know what they were, but I wanted to really understand what those gaps were and how, as a research scientist and somebody that's passionate about helping people, and as a scientist myself, how do I help close the gap? I was an outsider, of course. I was not traditionally trained in the industry. My background was in computer science and physics, although I studied psychology and neuroscience, was not really part of where I was going in my life at the time. But as soon as I started down the path in my mid-20s to really double down on putting together some research studies and really double-clicking and really understanding the history of the mental health industry, I realized that there was a lot of opportunity to evolve the current approaches. If you think about it, if the mental health industry had made more strides, or as many strides as they said they had, people would be doing a lot better, but people were still taking a lot of mental health medications and going to therapy, and people didn't seem to be doing all that much better. And in fact, the statistics said that people were doing worse. And it kind of scratching my head. Well, if the approaches are effective, then people should be doing that much better, but they're not. So I really started to think through, what is the gap? What is the challenge that a therapist faces when they start interacting with a client? And that's where the original research study came from. It came out of the idea of when a therapist asked, tell me a little bit about yourself, it seemed to me that that's a really challenging question to answer. There seems to be a lot of gaps in the understanding that somebody has about their own history and who they are as a person. And it seems like the therapist was left almost like a mining expedition to try and figure out who this person really is. It seemed like a very laborious and challenging task. It was like they were playing a connect the dots game with events from the person's past that was self-reported, by the way. So this is all self-reported information, which means that the person really has to understand themselves really well and their history. And if you understand anything about how memory works or how we're sort of wired through our own experiences that we're woefully unaware of, it would become clear that that's really a very challenging task for a therapist to pursue. And there's actually a name for that. It's called the introspection illusion. So I thought to myself, well, is there a way that we can at least mitigate or even overcome the introspection illusion. And that was my original research study. It was called the language association and categorization and the introspection illusion. So what I realized is that although what was explained to the therapist might not be exactly what was going on, it must at least refer to what was going on. In other words, if the person is self-reporting a bunch of information, could the information be used in a way with a proper strategy to overcome or at least mitigate the introspection illusion and really helping the therapist and the person to understand themselves at a more fundamental level? That's exactly what the study showed. What I did was helped the participants build what I called the language association and categorization system, turned into a therapeutic asset that if you take all this self-reported language and start to categorize that language in specific ways and build associations in that language, the person gets a lot better understanding of who they are. The first thing to do would be to understand, how do we sort of segregate who that person is into sort of categories? So what I call that is the person's mental core. The mental core is made up of a bunch of beliefs and values and principles and positive attributes and not so positive attributes and things that the person struggles with, and everything that makes the person who they are is part of this mental core. And if you really separate those out into these different categories of, say, the beliefs and values, positive attributes, things that they might want to be more like, but they're not quite yet, things that they struggle with, and you ask them to describe those things in detail, that gives you a basis for extracting language and really how they describe themselves in very important ways. And if you start to look at categories, which is what we formed, which we called cognitive traps, these cognitive traps would be familiar to anybody that studies cognitive behavioral therapy, things like minimizations or generalizations or mind reading. These categories have been demonstrated in research studies to indicate negative language patterns. So if I was to say, he's always late, that would be an exaggeration. It's a generalization. The person is probably not always late every single time. Or if I used judgmental language to say, this person is not a good person, or make some type of judgment on the other person. And there's a lot of that language that people are using that can indicate negative language constructs that can point to negative aspects of the person's as the person's mental core. So by categorizing, and there were 15 categories in the study, by categorizing that language in specific ways, it started to reveal a lot more about the person. We also used popular cognitive biases as well as lists of virtues. This is not about just the negative, it was also about identifying the positive. So once you had these categories set, it really helped the person to understand themselves better, but we went further than that. We started to build associations with the language, patterns of language that showed up across the aspects of the person's mental core. For example, if you were to describe something in an aspect of your positive attributes in a way that was similar to something that was part of your negative aspects of your mental core, and there was some type of relational pattern there, that could indicate a problem. If you're describing something that's really positive and another aspect that's negative, and the language is very similar, that can indicate something that could be troubling. So by building these categorizations and associations, these started to really reveal more about the person and really helped to reveal a lot of things that were currently hidden because of this introspection illusion. So what were the findings? Well, it was really powerful. The research participants, as they went through this process of building the LACS, they started to get, the reports were 95% gained a better understanding about themselves, and 78% had significant clarity breakthroughs, with 71% improved their subjective well-being within 6 months. The reason the subjective well-being increases because, and this was one of the original hypotheses, was that if you understand yourself better, then you end up feeling better. Your subjective well-being starts to increase because you start to resolve a lot of the tension inside of yourself because of the lack of understanding of who you are and the motives of why you do certain things. When you start to really examine who you are as a person, the source for some of your behavioral patterns become a lot clearer, which in this study showed that the subjective well-being would increase. So once we exited that research study, we had this amazing asset called the LACS, this Language Association and Categorization System. But we carried that forward. I carried that forward into the additional research studies. The second research study was called the Psychological Dissonance and its role in physiological stress and subjective well-being. So this really was predicated on the fact that we have these disconnects between our identities and personas. I'm going to do a talk in the future of a full episode on identities and personas and all the details around this. But the long and short of it is we're not consistently the same person, obviously, in different situations. I'm going to be different to a work colleague than I am with a friend, or I'm going to be different with an acquaintance than I am with my family. That's totally normal and expected. The problem becomes when we are wanting other people to perceive or receive us in specific ways, and we're not really that person, or we are trying to contrive an identity that is not that's really not who we really are inside. Personas are just a representation, an internal representation of who we are. It comes from the word from Greek for the word mask. It's really a mask that people would put on. So you can think of a persona as some type of, think back to where the mental core comes in. The mental core is the essence of who you are. It's really all these different beliefs, values, principles, attributes, and some of those come together to form these internal representations, or what we call personas. You put this persona on and you portray a particular identity to the world. But the problem becomes when we have these disconnects, this dissonance inside, that we're trying to misrepresent ourselves, or we want other people to see us in a particular way that we don't really have a persona for. Or maybe it's aligned to some type of negative aspect of our mental core. I called those core disharmonies. The hypothesis was that the higher level of dissonance inside, or the larger number of core disharmonies, the higher the stress levels. And we all know what stress does to the body and to our physical health. And of course, physical health is mental health. So the idea was that if somebody's stress level's high because of these disconnects, then their subjective well-being would be low, their stress levels would be high, their mental well-being would certainly be effective, and potentially even their physical well-being. So how do we overcome this? Well, we leverage the LACS through those associations and building that clarity. We were able to guide the participants through this self-discovery and to help heal and resolve this inner dissonance. We ended up calling it this idea of identity mapping these identities that they were portrayed to the outside through the personas, and then taking those personas and mapping those to the parts of their mental core, the source of where those identities really were coming from. And if they were rooted in negative aspects of their mental core, well, that's going to be a problem. So shifting it from the negative aspects of their mental core to positive ones allowed them to start to resolve the dissonance inside and portray more positive identities to the world, and make sure that they were representing themselves in a consistent way that was mapping to positive aspects of who they are. So what's the results? It was pretty powerful. We had some participants that really did a lot of deep work with identity mappings, and then we had another group that did not do that deep work with the identity mappings, but really just worked through the categorization system. And but either way, it was very, very powerful. The results, we had 14%. We had a scale of 1 to 100 for subjective well-being. That was our baseline. And at the end of 3 months, the participants that did not do the identity work showed 14% increase in their subjective well-being scores and 21% increase total at 6 months. The group that did do the identity work had an 18% increase in subjective well-being scores at 3 months and 32% at 6 months. So it's very compelling, very powerful results. This really showed that by reducing this internal dissonance, that by really helping them resolve these core disharmonies, the associated stress would be decreased, subjective well-being would increase, and mental health would improve. And I have follow-on studies to show that similar results would be represented for physical health as well. Of course, again, physical health is mental health. So would not be surprising if that's the case. The last study that was really pulled it all together is influencing predictive response cycles to improve mental health. I'm going to do an entire episode on the unconscious mind and how the unconscious is a prediction machine. But the long and short of it is our brain really generates predictions as to which are really guesses as to what it thinks you need in order to survive your next moment. It's not a matter of thriving or some future success. It's really surviving your next moment. It's really to move you away from threat and towards safety. So the way that it works is it generates a prediction, which gives you some type of sensations, energy of the body, and certain information through thoughts and narratives that show up. And it empowers or drives some type of response to the world. That response then gets you feedback from the world, and that feedback gets feedback into the prediction machine. The prediction then is generated, the next prediction is generated, which then drives a response, which then you get a response back from the world, and that's fed back in, and so on and so forth. Wash, rinse, and repeat. These are what I refer to as predictive response cycles, or PRCs. This is really the habitual cycles that we follow in our lives, and if we're living a perfect life, then great, everything's great. But most people are struggling in some meaningful way. And it's really these predictive response cycles that are the opportunity to change the outcomes that we have and how we show up in our life. So what typically is happening is that the negative predictive response cycles are being reinforced. And that's what really shows up as these behavioral issues that we all have, and shows up as our mental health challenges. So how do we resolve these? Well, we already had all the ingredients. We already went through a journey of self-discovery. We understood ourselves at a more fundamental level through the LACS. We resolved these core disharmonies. We have all the ingredients with this clarity to identify first the these triggers that would cause negative predictive response cycles, which I called cognitive catalysts. I called that because a catalyst is something that speeds up a response. So a cognitive catalyst is something that speeds up a response to a situation. It's not necessarily negative, but if it is negative, it's something we want to address. So the whole idea is to build action plans, very similar to some other approaches in something like cognitive behavioral therapy. The difference being is the clarity and the perspective that the person has based on the previous work that was done. Once you have the clarity through the LACS and you've healed and strengthened your mental core through the second study, resolving the core disharmonies, you are that much better in a position to identify the triggers, those cognitive catalysts, and then to create associated action plans to mindfully intervene in the negative predictive response cycles. The point of the entire research studies was to show the person how to train the unconscious to generate more proportionate energy and more empowering information. The challenge is that what is being generated by the unconscious through these predictions is disproportionate energy, not appropriate amounts of energy given the situation, and or negative information, both of which can sweep people away in the moment rather than something that they leverage to empower them in their moment. So the whole idea is to identify what these cognitive catalysts are, create an appropriate action plan, and then mindfully lean into those experiences and evoke those action plans to retrain the unconscious of how you want to show up and respond to the world. Over time, the unconscious kind of gets the hint and you end up directly training your unconscious to empower you in your moments rather than having you show up in the way that does not serve you or others. So what are the findings? We had an 89% improved responses within to triggering events in 3 months by leveraging the action plans. And after 6 months, 72% reported having more of a naturally responding to these triggering events in a more positive way, with another 20% reporting it was easier than before. So in other words, the participants it became just how they responded. It's not something they had to consciously think about or put effort into. It's just how they started to show up. Those three research studies together formed cognitive response therapy, which again came to fruition around 2015. And then I formed follow-on mental health programs like mental fitness training, and as well as the latest framework, which is the ARATE framework, which stands for Awareness, Response, Action, Effort, and Time. Cognitive response therapy is really encompassed in the first two phases, which is awareness and response. But it's really a holistic framework that really empowers people to live their optimal life. So at this point, we have these amazing certification programs for cognitive response therapy that really empower people to get at the foundation of what causes mental health challenges by coupling that with the biological, physiological mechanisms that cause mental health issues, which I will definitely cover in future episodes. Just as a preview to that, it's really metabolic in nature. So understanding how to get your biology right and your physiology right, so that you're not fighting your physiology of say, for example, if you're having sleep issues or diet issues or some type of vitamin deficiencies or anything like this that is really biological nature, getting that sort of in order first, and then learning how to recondition your nervous system, which is really the whole idea of cognitive response therapy at its core, as I demonstrated through these research studies. Once you have that, this is what empowers you to live an optimal life. So that's what we're going to learn in future episodes here at the Optimal Life Podcast. We're going to, again, have additional guests here to talk about their research. We'll be talking a little bit more about the science behind cognitive response therapy. We'll be giving some guidance on how to move forward in your own practices if you want to learn a little bit more of how to impact and help your clients. If you want to just help yourself, this is the place to come and learn how to live an optimal life. So until next time, I'll leave you with this. We live a life of contentment rather than purpose. It is time that we all become agents of change in the new era of mental health. Let's make this happen together.